Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our second keynote, Elevating Women's Sports, the Power of Strategic Brand Partnerships. We'll be featuring executives, Disney, this is Disney's panel, Disney and Google, special guest, former WNBA player Sylvia Fowels. They'll all be coming out in just a minute, but we'd like to talk for a second about the panel. Exciting lineup of speakers. To kick things off, we'd like to introduce our panelists. Molly Beck, the strategy lead of sports and entertainment marketing partnerships at Google. Molly, thank you for coming. Appreciate it very much. Sylvia Fowles, the retired WNBA player and a legend in women's basketball. Sylvia, thank you for being here. And last but certainly not least, Wendell Scott, SVP of Sales at Disney Advertising.
Morning. Morning, Rick. Ladies.
Wendell, how are you?
Thank you.
So, Wendell, let's talk about it first. How do you measure the success of these brand integrations in terms of advertising and advancing women's sports more than anything else?
Sure. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. With us, we look at it as sort of a bit of a triangle, right? So with Disney and more particularly ESPN, our mission, if you go to Bristol, Connecticut, you'll see it everywhere, is to serve sports fans anytime, anywhere. And we've been doing that. I think ESPN is going to have its 45th birthday this September. And we've had over 3 decades of serving women's sports in particular. 25 years with the WNBA, actually. So your career launched across the ESPN, so thank you for that as well. And when you think about also serving the athlete, right, and particularly women's female athletes, we want to make sure that we give them the best and the most exposure across the Disney portfolio and across the ESPN. In 2023, we did over almost 28,000 hours of women's sports across the ESPN. So the athletes deserve that exposure. And if you're serving sports fans and serving athletes, that's where smart brands like Google come in. And they challenge us to figure out how they can use that background, that backdrop, to tell some of their best stories, sell some of their products and their services. And what we've seen is how we are measuring that success, in particular, Rick, is in a lot of ways. One is by the amount of hours that we're giving to women's sports, but particularly I think everyone knows that there has been a huge increase in viewership and ratings. I think right now the WNBA is continuing to break records, right? Not just with attendance, but with viewership as well. We saw what happened with March Madness, and you can say March Madness for both men's and women's now. So you can say March Madness just once, and you know what that means. Actually outdrawing the men's tournament as well. So that's one other measure of success. And then right now, brands are flocking to Disney and ESPN to figure out solutions on how they can best market to the audiences and to the fans of women's sports as well. So when you take a look at how that triangle is working, I think it's working really well.
Molly, you've had tremendous partnerships all over the industry. Specifically, tell us about Google's role in supporting women's sports through those strategic partnerships.
Yeah, we've actually been on a journey for the last few years. Starting in 2021, we actually, prior to that, we had an internal team that was really passionate about looking at women's sports holistically. So not only the way that we invest in media, the way that we structure partnerships, but also how women's sports shows up on Google's platforms. A lot of people turn to Google and to YouTube to learn about women's sports, to engage. So really taking a thoughtful eye to those experiences in our own ecosystem. And one of the exercises that came out of that was to kind of say, if we wanted to spend with our partners and in media equitably, the way that we spend in men's sports and women's sports, what would need to be true? What would we need to do to make that happen? And when we did that exercise, we realized that there wasn't actually enough media inventory for women's sports in the marketplace for us to bring ourselves to parity. And so that led to a really productive conversation with our partners at ESPN to kind of say, if we come into this space, how do we create more access, more visibility, more awareness? How do we just open this up so that new fans can find it? And so what we did at the outset of our 2021 year was we partnered with the WNBA to make sure that we're investing with the league, with the rights, with the partners to make sure that we can authentically show up in the space, but then also work with ESPN to make sure that we are bringing additional games to air. So I think that was the 25th season of the W. And we brought 25 games, made sure 25 games were on broadcast in regular season to really help make it more accessible and open up that fandom. So that was kind of really where we started with partnerships. And since then, we've tried to kind of iterate because at some point you'll reach a diminishing return on adding games. You can keep adding games, but there's so much more happening around women's sports than just the live consumption. So we've also been working with, in 2023, we partnered with The Athletic to make sure that they had enough staff on hand to cover women's sports to the extent and to the quality that they wanted to as they double down on NWSL, WNBA coverage, Women's World Cup. And then we recently signed this year with the NWSL partners as a league partner, and then just yesterday announced a partnership with the Players Associations for the WNBA, the NWSL, and the U.S. Women's National Soccer Team. So there's a lot of different ways for us that we've approached partnerships. It hasn't always been media forward. It hasn't always been partner first, but they have all been kind of a mix of holistic tactics and different endeavors to kind of figure out the best way to make a positive impact in the space.
And your relationship with ESPN, Disney, et cetera, rock solid, right?
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
Rock solid, continue to be rock solid. So, Sylvia, on July 10, Edge Wilson joined you as the only two players in WNBA history with games of 20 points, 20 rebounds, 3+ steals. We talked about that on the beforehand, and 3 blocks. Both games came against the Storm. Share your journey and also how you've seen the fandom of women's sports evolve during your career.
Back when I started in 2008, I felt like a lot of my generation and generation before me was clawing to get the attention and a seat at the table. And now, leaving in 2023, you can see the evolution of the game. I think you guys can see the attendance that we get with these games and how much you all played a big role in making sure we get on TV. And so I think it's going to only get great from here on out, and we have a long way to go to try to level this playing field. But I think you guys doing a really good job of making sure you listening to us, putting us in the right spotlights, but also telling our stories and making sure we're being authentic to ourselves.
And so talk about the changes then and now. I mean, now it's a little bit of a different perspective for you, but yeah, reflect. Do a little reflection.
Okay. So like I said, when I first came in, we was sharing roommates. We was chartering. I mean, we wasn't chartering. We was flying regular commercial. But now these young ladies have charter. They get their own rooms. We have an unbelievable TV time, which is great. We get to show our faces, but also engage with our fans on a more authentic level and share our stories. And I think that's the most important part. And to continue to grow this game, I think it's also important.
Wendell, talk a little bit about specifics. Obviously, it's an incredibly creative world that you're involved in. Talk about the initiatives with Google that promote women's sports, the 50-50 initiative, in addition to Disney's additional purpose-driven programmings and offerings.
Sure. The real opportunity that Disney and ESPN capitalizes on is our opportunity to do the best storytelling in sports. And so, obviously we would not be here if it wasn't for something like Title IX, right? And so let's talk a little bit about that. So in 2022, Title IX celebrated its 50th anniversary. And much like in the 30 for 30 sort of realm, we did a 50 for 50 which we, found and sourced, 50 interesting stories of 50 interesting athletes who told how Title IX affected their lives, affected their ability to compete, and was the very beginning of what is now a bit more of an equitable opportunity for women's sports overall. So we launched that program. It started, each program and each episode started on ESPN and then lived going on and going forward on YouTube. Thank you, Molly, for that. And then Google really leaned into that, actually. Google and YouTube is like one of the leaders in finding creators and storytellers. And so they also helped and found and sourced, upwards of like maybe 5 stories across ESPN's 50 for 50 in telling stories in and around Title IX. What's really interesting is, we speak about this a lot, is the reason why, right? Why is women's sports having this insurgence? I wouldn't say resurgence because it's been here for a long time. It's having this insurgence right now. Is because I think not only are you seeing some of the best, competitive athletes in the world, but you're also learning a lot, about their stories as well. One of the things that we did going into the Women's Final Four this year is we did a behind the scenes with Caitlin Clark, Camila Cardoso, and Kiki Rice. And when you think that you know so much about them, the actual stories and how you can see their personalities sort of shine through. The interesting stories of Kiki Rice and, growing up in the DC area and what her family has meant to, politics, so on and so forth. Caitlin Clark being, a native of Iowa and playing for her, her hometown university and having a lot of success, obviously. And then Camila Cardoso coming from a very challenging part of Brazil. And you learn more about these athletes, and ESPN really leans into that storytelling. And what we did with Google, as I said, around 50 for 50 was a very, very good opportunity around that.
Yeah, and obviously we led with the kind of brand integration stuff because that's always more important today than it ever has been. Storytelling. You got to get behind those. That's exactly what you were just talking about. So Molly, as you discuss marketing partnerships with Disney and otherwise, audience engagement, marketing strategy, but also the importance of authentic partnerships to let you build the brand. Talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, I think what we have really enjoyed about getting started in women's sports was how much unique atmosphere there is. Sport is a passion point for so many people. It is a unifier across cultures, across communities. And so I think it's always been compelling to brands. But what we've really seen as women's sports has flourished, as partners and platforms like Disney and ESPN have brought more games, made, just opened the aperture to the experience, told more stories about the players. It's created an ecosystem that in some ways is very different than men's sports. And so it's allowed us to kind of try new things, to come in with partners that are eager and excited to experiment. And when Google gets involved, we really like to think about not only who we're talking to, the audience we're reaching, but how are we showing up with value? How are we adding something into that ecosystem? So we can show up, we can put our logo on things, that's fine. A lot of people have probably heard of Google already. So I don't know that logos alone are really going to do the job for us. So we really like to think about who is the audience, and if they are there because they love this sport, why are we there too, right? What are we bringing to the table as a partner that really is going to elevate that experience for fans? And so that's kind of allowed us to think through creative ways to address fandom. As Sylvia pointed out, fans are changing, and that's not just fans of women's sports. The moment and time we're in, they are engaging with content in a different way. They are curious about players and their personalities and their families and their lives in a different way. And Google can be a great resource for people to learn more and to get closer to what they love. So we really tried to think about what are the extensions that allow our technology to bring fans closer to what they love. And is that additional games that they can consume in live time? Is that content behind the scenes that we're capturing on Pixel phones and making available on social media? Is that search trends and illuminating kind of what is going on with the orange hoodie and what, whose shoes are those and who is wearing what in the tunnel? That type of dimensionality, I think is really coming into just a renaissance around sport and women's sport in particular. And so as we show up as a partner, we're always trying to be thoughtful of not just how do we invest and show our support monetarily, but how are we thinking through the holistic fan experience and finding authentic ways to show up, whether it's with the league, whether it's with talent. So in 2022, we did our first kind of crossover spot featuring both WNBA and NBA players together and really kind of bridging that divide to say fans are fans are fans are fans, but how do we acknowledge them for their unique tastes and interests? And how do we kind of meet them where they are in a way that feels additive and kind of not accretive?
Sylvia, you're pioneer. You've seen, we asked it earlier, not fair to reflect that this whole world, there's been such a sea change over the last few years that what it was like 5-10 years ago, nothing like it is today. But you're surrounded with life partners, friends to help grow the business. How do the partnerships help overcome the perceptions of, well, lack of funding? There's some media perceptions about where, women's sports has been. How do these guys make the world easier, let's say?
I think just about putting us out. I think as you go to different levels of how you play from middle school, high school, college, you're picking up these new fans and you engaging with people that you're meeting for the first time. So having us have the ability to have our face in the community and making sure they get our stories out plays a big part. But just knowing that we're picking up fans across the board and we want to be able to do it with the partners that we have.
Yeah. And so the partners you have, how do you build on the vision? And it changes so rapidly. Today, all of a sudden the WNBA players are flying first class. How did that happen? I mean, and on and on and on. So tomorrow it could be much different, right?
Yes. I think just understanding that we are multifaceted people. We're not one-dimensional. Yes, sports is what we do, but understanding that it's more to us than besides basketball. And I think understanding who we are and wanting to partner with us to get our stories out there plays a big part. But Google's been doing a great job. ESPN been doing a great job. Mael, AT&T, Voice in Sports. And so they played a big part in how we perceive ourselves and how we give ourselves to the community.
Yeah. And so these guys are 24/7. They're figuring out, right, how to make your league and everybody else in women's sports thrive,
Right.
not just survive. You get up every morning, and I know it's not on here, but you get up every morning and you say, how are we going to make women's sports better today? What are the 3 things I'm going to do today that are more creative than our guys down the street? And you're obsessed with all this, aren't you? In a good way.
Sure. So in thinking about that and answering that question, we think about what's next, right? At Disney and ESPN.
Right.
And there hasn't been a discussion with a marketer in sports over the last 12 to 24 months that hasn't talked about how to activate best against women's athletes in women's sports. And we have developed a marketing platform and initiative called Level Up, right? So what does that mean, right? You obviously see that the athletes and the exposure, they're definitely leveling up overall. How do we be the best consultants to help marketers show up authentically, right? How do we help them think about their messaging creatively? Because for the most part, sports has been sort of coming through like a male lens, even when it comes to marketing and advertising. So how do we lean into our creative resources to actually help marketers tell some great stories? And one of the other things that are very interesting, particularly across Disney and ESPN, when marketers have worked with our talent, for the most part, over the years, it's been a lot of our male talent, our male broadcasters on SportsCenter, or our former male athletes. But what we're proud about at Disney and ESPN is that we probably have the most female analysts, former athletes, broadcasters on SportsCenter, covering all types of sports. And there's a real opportunity for marketers to leverage what is the next generation, if you will, of broadcasters and analysts. When people say the future is female, the future is right now. So what we're trying to do is get marketers to level up in every single way in and around that investment to actually show that investing in women's sports actually can increase your KPIs, right? Get you there faster. We have a thing that we say at Disney and ESPN that investing in women's sports is good for business.
Follow up with that, and
Please.
I want to ask the same kind of question to you. And it's easy because you do it every day. But social responsibility, we're in a state of flux now. The whole NIL with the college world, and should we say the high school and junior high school world too? I mean, it's how do we get we could easily say, how do you get the toothpaste back in the tube? But it's not. It's done. And so what do you think your role as really somebody that in many ways defines the future of women's sports, for example, is to help shape that debate, shape the governance, and not just the mundane, the relative conference realignment issues, but the whole moral issues of NIL and otherwise. How do you approach that?
Well, I think, we have a huge responsibility, actually. It is a big responsibility, right? When you think about just coming off of the Women's Final Four over the last few years, actually, which has been just tremendous for us. Like, look at what came about at the WNBA draft, right? The highest rated WNBA draft that we've ever had. And so we have a real responsibility to have the right people in place to actually, tell the stories and represent the athletes really well. I think you might have seen across, other platforms that sometimes there have been some missteps in actually, that's what I'm talking about, and how they are, talking about, female competition, so on and so forth, or just competition. It's like almost like this game. It's like, you go to a different conference. It's like a drinking game. How many times? Every time you hear women's sports, you have a drink, or if you hear AI, the same thing. But but the way we look at it is that if we are covering women's sports and female athletes authentically, giving them the most exposure across our platform as possible, and then also letting them actually come out front and tell their stories too. Because what we've seen is outside of a handful of really good WNBA players, a lot of people didn't know too much. A lot of people are actually experiencing women's sports writ large, at a heightened level every single day. And sports fans, they pride themselves on their knowledge of their favorite sport. And what we're just trying to do is to connect the actual fandom to the actual athletes. And if we do that really well, I think brands will show up and look to work more with ESPN and Disney, and actually elevating the investment so that, we won't have conversations around like how someone's actually getting to a game. No one actually ever thinks about that in a men's sport at all, right?
Right.
People realize, Caitlin Clark came out and have, her shoe deal, but Sabrina Ionescu had her shoe deal a few years prior to that. Yeah. And quite frankly, there's a small school right in the backyard of ESPN that has been probably like at the pinnacle of women's college basketball, like LSU as well. But, so like it's been there. So this
you said small school?
UConn, I meant. I said small school.
Just trying to figure out what small means. I mean, really?
Comparatively, if you will. Okay, comparatively, if you will. And so, like, it's really interesting that we're having this conversation right now. We have a great game going on tonight. You have the WNBA All-Star game happening right now. There's just so much opportunity to actually cover women's sports authentically and make sure that brands are showing up in the right way.
Obviously, the great vision, great mandate. You should be excited to hear what your partner says. So the other partner, you've got a platform that gives you the ability not just to do a business deal, but basically a brand investment to be able to shape the future of the industry. You got activations, but you're looking toward the future as well. How do you ensure diversity, inclusion, good examples that dollars that are generated from your partnerships get spread around all sports, not just basketball, for women's sports? So, give us your philosophy on all that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The approach to sport is a little bit like the approach to marketing Google. Yeah. Google is a website for human beings that are interested in learning anything, something. directions, recipes. If we paneled everyone with the last Google search they made, it would be pretty diverse, right? So we are speaking to and we are trying to connect to an incredibly broad audience. And when you parallel that to the types of fans, where they come from, their experiences, the players that they resonate with and why, the storylines that they're interested in, how they consume. Is it live games? Is it highlights only? Are they just following individual athletes for the gossip so they can keep up with friends at school? Like, fandom is so diverse. And so as we think through the way that we show up in sport, I think going back to my comment earlier about kind of the unique opportunity with women's sport is coming into its own in an era that is already incredibly open-minded. And so there's a huge opportunity to continue to keep this atmosphere that everyone is welcome at women's sports. And I don't know how many people in the room have been to a WNBA game, an NWSL game, a college softball game, a college volleyball game, a youth soccer game. Everyone should feel welcome in sport and in women's sport in particular. And so as we think through the way that we are showing up with our investments, we are trying to be very mindful about the partners that we're working with, again, how we show up with those partners, and then also being relevant in the markets and in the moments. So last year was the launch of Women's Premier League Cricket. And so a number of our local teams immediately reached out and kind of said, what are we going to do? When Google does women's sports, it's happening here. It's finally happening here. And so our strategy has to be nimble enough to say, what can we take from our forays into the WNBA in this market, or to Women's Super League, Arsenal, the Lionesses, Liverpool, our investments in Europe, our Aussie Rules, AFLW partnership in Australia, and how do we kind of connect the dots to make sure that whenever a new market comes online and has kind of found the property that they think is going to help them be really relevant and additive in the women's sports space, that we are sharing those learnings, and that we're being really thoughtful about what diversity looks like in that market, what those fans look like in that market, and continue to just kind of meet them where they are with what they're hoping to get out of their sports experience.
7-minute think about life-defining closing thoughts. So back to you. So just think about it in a minute. But before we do that, responsibilities, obligations, players in this industry. You got two dynamic partners who will build the brands, whether it's cricket or basketball or golf or tennis or everybody else, and reach the moon with these astronomical numbers. What's the role of a female athlete today in helping to build the brand that's compatible to their corporate expansion of that brand? What's the obligation?
Making sure I'm showing up in every way possible. I think a lot of people associate me with just basketball and the things that I did on the court, but community work is also important. So making sure I'm showing up to these places that I played, and making sure I'm engaging, make sure I'm giving out the proper information, making sure I'm answering the right questions about what it takes to get to this point, how are you mental at this point. And so just giving them as much as knowledge as I had or was given, and making sure I'm passing it on to continue the trend.
Molly, around the clock, and we're going to do this. We'll cut your mic. Oh, no, they only do that in presidential debates. They don't do it here. So we got a couple of minutes from you on where Google is not only today, but the industry, and where it's going to be in 5 years.
That's a good one. Didn't prepare that one in advance.
No, you winged it.
You just need that. I think, we're not quite at 5 years from when we started our endeavors in women's sports, but we're getting close. What I was actually reflecting on recently, so I'm going to take the long way to your question, but I'll get there.
No, you do what you want.
Last week was the 25th anniversary of Brandi Chastain's famous goal, which took place at the Rose Bowl, which was just a few miles from my house. I grew up playing soccer, and that for me is a moment I will never forget. It was a seminal moment in sport for me. And I've been thinking a lot about, where we find ourselves and where we think women's sports will be 5 years from now. And And I think about that moment and like, what is it about this moment that's so different from 25 years ago? Why is there momentum now? And it is a factor not of talent. We have had talent in women's sport for so long. The product has always been so good. And I think about the responsibility of all of the players in the sports ecosystem to help keep momentum and build momentum, right? So when I watched the national team game in 1999, you watched FIFA and you watched the World Cup, and then the World Cup ended, and then there was, I'm dating myself, there was no internet. You couldn't keep up with those players again. You didn't see them until the next time they were on TV or the next time they were in Sports Illustrated or in the news. And that is completely changed in the moment in time that we're in. And momentum is lightning in a bottle. You can't decide when and where things are going to have momentum. And it is such a wonderful moment to find ourselves in, that a long deserved part of sport, women's sport, has been waiting to be discovered, right? And they have had loyalists and true fans for years and years, and they've had deep talent for years and years of deep talent. So it's not about an individual. It's not about the name on the headlines right now. For me, this is a long time coming. And we finally kind of hit the magic moment where media is in a position to help amplify the story, to keep the momentum. Coverage is improved in a way that, like, you're getting prime time, you're getting, slots where it can be found without having to scroll to deep channels on your direct TV, or it's just this huge opportunity that we find ourselves in. And I think in some ways, if you flash back 5 years to what people thought today was, this would have been a dream. This would have been wouldn't it be wild if there was more interest in women's March Madness than men's? And that felt like kind of a radical hope, but an attainable hope. And we're in it. And so as I think 5 years from now, we kind of joke that in some ways I'm trying to put myself out of business with panels like this. A women's sports specific panel 5 years from now, is it just going to be sports, right? Is it just going to be, we have men's, women's, it's just sports. And maybe that's where we'll be, and maybe it's not. But I think what we've seen over the last 5 is that so much is possible. And when all partners in the ecosystem are leaning in to that same end, when brands are supporting the leagues, who are supporting the players, who are reaching out to the fans, who are engaging with media, it's all just one big ecosystem. And I think the more invested we all are, we're only going to continue to see this flourish.
Ground floor of a new world. You killed it. Sylvia, interesting, because it's LSU's always been dynamite football team, but now we got it not relevant to women's sports, but you got one of your baseball alums starting the All-Star game tonight, but his friend is one of the top gymnasts as far as impressions in the history of the world. You got Angel, you got all of the LSU making a name for itself in all contexts. But look ahead, not just where LSU athletics are 5 years from now, but where this whole movement is and world 5 years from now.
Oh man, if I had to put in perspective of what I want my dream to look like for women's sports, especially basketball, I definitely would say more teams, one, bigger partnership, sponsorships, deals, and us making more money, of course. And I'm not talking about making money like the men. I'm talking about just leveling out the playing fields and getting what we deserve and what's worth of what we do. If I had to choose those things, I think that's what 5 years will look like for us.
Why not? So, Wendell, last word, okay? And by the way, the guys, it's when it says Disney advertising, just for a second, listen to the day job. He oversees advertising sales for WPP and Dentsu holding companies across Disney portfolio brands, ABC, Hulu, Disney Plus, Disney Channels Worldwide, Disney Digital, ESPN, Freeform, FX, National Geographic. And that's just until 4 o'clock, and we've got other stuff going on. So talk about, from a broad perspective, about all of this. Where's the industry? Where's Disney's place in the industry 5 years from now?
So when I think about, 5 years from now, ESPN and Disney is investing in that, right? So I'll give you a really good example. So we just recently renewed our partnership with the NCAA, right, for the next, I think, 8 years. And for the first time, there was equity in the investment and exposure between men's and women's sports. So because the way that we're going to get there, to what you were just talking about, Sylvia, and the way that you were talking about, Amali, that the differences between the investment, the opportunity, the viewership, the marketing opportunity between men's and women's sports will just be, as Molly was saying, what is the best thing I can do in sports right now, obviously. And that could be in and around investing with ESPN and Disney in and around women's sports. But it starts with how platforms like Disney and ESPN invest. So the next 5 years and the next 10 years coming, you will see a lot more from ESPN and Disney as relates to how we create more exposure for women's athletes, how we, do our best to tell stories around competition, and how we also make sure that we give marketers the opportunity to market their products and services. Because we talk about women's sports, we haven't talked about fans, right? And when you kind of get back to it, I said that was our mission, to serve sports fans. And women's sports fans aren't just women, obviously. They are a diverse group of fans, male, female, diverse in race, in gender, in every way. And there are a lot of interesting ways to tell those stories. And to your point, we talk about being responsible. We need to be responsible in how we tell the stories about the diversity of the women who are competing in women's sports.
That's an amazing way to end, because we all ought to be reassured. Believe it or not, Disney is even ratcheting up, has more of a commitment than they have been before. So it's gone from Titanic to unbelievable. Molly, Sylvia, Wendell, thank you very much. We all understand that the industry on the retail side is in great hands because of our first keynote panel. They're in even better hands because of these folks on the stage, and more to come, as we said. Thank you all very much. Appreciate the keynote for today.